Hello and welcome to the Khayrion podcast, your guide to everything concerning the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond.
Today, we are going to speak about energy-related issues, and here I have with me my colleague, Professor László Csicsmann, who is an expert on economy issues and energy issues, and I myself, I am Erzsébet N. Rózsa. So the first question would be, when we speak energy, we usually, in fact, mean energy resources. With regard to the Middle East, but also in a more general sense, what are the energy resources we are thinking of?
Good afternoon. That's a very good question. And we have to differentiate between the so-called fossil fuels like natural gas, oil, coals, and as well as the renewables energy. Within that, of course, wind and solar energy and water energy, the most important factors, as well as the nuclear energy. But at this moment of the Middle Eastern energy mix mainly relies on hydrocarbons and especially natural gas and oil, approximately 90% of the region's energy consumption and production builds on that.
Where can we find oil and gas in the Middle East? Because we can usually hear that there are oil-rich countries and there are countries which have no real energy resources or not very much to rely on. So where exactly in this wider region of the Middle East and North Africa can we find oil and gas?
First of all, we have to emphasize that approximately 50% of world oil reserves can be found in the Middle Eastern region. So it means approximately half or even more than half of world oil reserves in the Middle Eastern region. It's mainly in the Persian Gulf region. Saudi Arabia used to have the largest oil reserves. Besides Saudi Arabia, of course, Iraq is important, but because of the conflictious nature of the Iraqi state, not much modernization taken place recently in the Iraqi oil infrastructure, so it's a bit underdeveloped, but reserves are there. Of course, we have Iran as well, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait. So we used to call them from an economic point of view as rentier state, where large percentage of the state budget relies on oil revenues. And that's a very important source of budget. And of course, some other countries are non-oil producer countries. These countries themselves importing oil from the region. This is the case with the majority of states in the region. Just we can mention Turkey, we can mention Jordan, Israel, Syria, even Egypt, because of the large population. They have some oil reserves, but it is not enough for internal consumption. So because of that, they have to import from this region.
And what about North Africa?
In the North African case, Libya has one of the largest oil reserves because Algeria is rich in natural gas mainly. And, because the connectivity with the European continent, it's quite close. Of course, it's a very important connection. However, recently, the last decade, Libya has a kind of civil war situation after the fall of the Gaddafi regime. And for this reason, unfortunately, Libya's oil production and export is fluctuating now. But before the so-called Arab Spring, it was like 2% of the world oil production. I would say it's significant from the European perspective, especially because Libyan export is mainly for Southern European countries, Italy, France. So those countries were originally the main buyer of Libyan oil.
And as far as I have heard, it is not only the geographical proximity which plays a role in the access to oil resources, but also there is a difference between the different qualities of oil, and also oil refineries are very important. And the reason why I'm asking this question is that we have seen it in some local conflicts when an oil refinery can be a target in a military conflict, for example.
That's, I think, a very important question, because if you compare a Middle Eastern oil, we can say that the quality is quite high. It's a very fine quality of oil. And it's important to mention that the cost of oil production is relatively low in the Middle East compared with other regions. So that's very important. And oil refinery is very important. As you mentioned, this was the case in Saudi Arabia, which happened in autumn 2019, when some refineries attacked by drones, probably from Yemeni territory, which is not that much clear. But that's very important part of, and you know, it's important to mention that these countries mainly relies on oil and gas revenues, and there is a plan to diversify the economy, because we expect the end of the oil era, and these countries should prepare for the next century, which is not an oil-based economy, so mainly focusing on the renewables. And there are plans in Saudi Arabia, there is the Vision 2030, but there are some other plans in Oman, in United Arab Emirates, to diversify the economy, so not only relying on oil. And we have some successful cases. For instance, Dubai, which is part of the United Arab Emirates, which is a federation of 7 emirates. Dubai is mainly rely on commerce, commercial activities, construction, and this economy is quite diversified. Or very recently, Qatar's economy is focusing on services, financial services, and not mainly relying on natural gas.
Yes, this would be my next question. It seems to me that when we look at the map, where there is oil, there is almost surely gas as well. However, we still speak about different countries, or partly different countries where speaking about gas. And then we have two kinds of gases we can read about, the natural gas and the LNG, the liquefied natural gas. Could you please explain us what is that?
Yeah, but
and
first, let's speak a bit about the gas assets in the Middle East. I checked the data, and today the Middle East is home of around 38% of the world gas reserves, so about 1/3 or a bit more. And the largest reserves are in Qatar, in Iran, in some other countries as well, but the largest reserves in Qatar, in Iran. In North Africa, this is Algeria, which is very, very important. And very recently, new gas reserves found in the Eastern Mediterranean, where Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, which is not part of the Middle Eastern region, Greece as well, very important countries, and especially from a European perspective. So when the Russian-Ukraine war has started, some European leaders traveled, even the leaders of the European Union signed a kind of documents with Egypt and with other countries to buy those gas assets to diversify the European consumption, which should not be relied too much on the Russian gas because of the sanction situation.
How is this project going on? Because if I read it correctly, Turkey was left out of these plans, and Turkey got adamant, and they started a counter move with Libya, which is interesting because we usually do not know about gas in Libya. You mentioned the oil, which has been known for a while, but the figure that I read was that in Libya alone, there is as much gas as in this Eastern Mediterranean newly discovered gas resources, and Libya would be much closer to the European Union still. So there are these political and economy-based quarrels and controversies, but what is going on in fact?
Geopolitically speaking, in 2019, with the support of the European Union and the United States, some countries in the region formed a so-called energy hub, an Eastern Mediterranean energy hub. It's Israel, Egypt, Greece, Cyprus, and Lebanon as well later. It was part of the story. However, Turkey left out and Russia as well. And of course, it was the aim of the European Union to build a pipeline, which was called as the East Med pipeline, through Italy, reaching to European countries. However, because of the Russian-Ukraine war and other geopolitical facts, Turkey is getting closer now to Israel and to this energy hub. So I'm quite optimistic now about that. However, I think the main problem with Eastern Mediterranean gas is the quantity, which is not enough to replace the Russian gas. And the other issue which is important to mention, it was a question from you, is the difference between natural gas and LNG, because it's not only about export, but transportation of oil and gas is a very important geopolitical issue. And either we can have through pipelines, or we should liquefy the gas and transport with large tankers on the sea. However, liquefying natural gas is a costly issue. Transportation is a costly thing as well. And there is a lack of capacity of liquefying capacity, and especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt has 2 refinery capacity offshore. And it's very important to mention, for instance, when we are discussing the Israeli case, Israel should first transport this gas to Egypt, and then after modifying it into LNG, then Egypt will re-export towards Europe, or it's mainly towards Asia nowadays, but the plan is of course to increase the export, and it's a problem of capacity. So it's
do I understand it correctly that first you have to liquidify the gas, transport it in a liquid format, and then you have to transform it back into the gas that we are having in mind. So this is why it is a very difficult situation, and this is why you said that Egypt has both capacities to and from. Israel has, I think, only one capacity. And what happens, for example, with us? So if we see the situation that liquefied, so LNG is brought to the shores of Europe, then what happens next?
We need, of course, pipelines to transport the gas. So it's another problem as well. But let me return a bit to the very interesting question of the Persian Gulf, where the majority of gas can be found. And this is the problem with Qatar, because Iran is under sanctions now, but many European leaders signing agreements with Qatar buying LNG nowadays. But the problem is of the transportation, because how you liquefy natural gas, it's very costly for the European countries to transport gas. So I think it's a very, and of course it's very important to mention the role of Turkey as well, as not as a country of a source of natural gas, but very recently, for instance, Hungary signed agreement with Turkey to buy not only Turkish gas, because Turkey should also import gas, but Turkey is a very important part of the transportation route towards Europe. So, for instance, Azeri, Turkmenistan gas, Central Asia, Caucasus gas assets is also an option for the European countries.
And now let's turn to the renewables that you have mentioned. You have mentioned the solar energy, the wind. We all know that in the Middle East, the sun is practically always shining. So this could mean not only global warming and this kind of temperature crisis situations, but this could be an option of as an energy resource. And then there is the wind as well.
I would say that this is a strategic issue for oil-rich countries at the moment, and especially if you are reading the Vision 2030 of Saudi Arabia, it has the most ambitious plan. The plan is to reach a zero net emission by 2050, which means that renewables is the most important issue for these countries to invest in, because it needs a huge investment, a huge money. And these countries like Saudi Arabia, we mentioned Oman, United Arab Emirates, relies on oil revenue, and they try to invest in mainly solar project, because solar projects have the largest share within the renewables at this moment. We have the largest solar parks in that region, because you mentioned that's very important, that there is a plenty of sunshine even during the winter time. And in complementation of that, they rely on wind energy, but it's not well developed at this moment. And I read about that wind is usually good for night electricity at this moment, but it needs a huge investment. And for this reason, those countries started to privatize the national oil companies as well, like Aramco, the Saudi oil company, which we remember that most of the states nationalized those companies during the 1960s, 70s. And now we see a different movement, because there is a need for funds, investment, and it's mainly used for the renewables. And of course, where the money comes from, it's either China or United States or European countries also invest in. But China, it seems, is the largest investor in renewables in the Middle East, which means that China's perception is not just about the present situation, but it's something to do with the near future. As you may know that when we are discussing oil and natural gas, China is largely dependent on Middle East oil. Approximately 50% of Chinese oil import originating from 3 or 4 Middle Eastern countries, including Iran as well, not officially, Iran unofficially, I would say, in the black market or gray zone, because of the secondary sanctions of the United States at this moment is not an option to buy Iranian oil. However, the statistics tells us that Iranian oil export towards China is increasing at this moment.
Let's turn to water. It is a generally held view that the Middle East, or at least parts of the Middle East and North Africa, are under a huge water stress. In some places, clear drinking water is running out altogether. I think Yemen is especially the case, where now they say that practically the whole population goes without free access to drinking water. And on the other hand, we also know that there are 3 main water systems in the region, plus a very interesting issue which has been started to be discovered is the underground water reservoirs under the Sahara. So could you please speak a little bit about these main water systems to our listeners?
I think we should differentiate between the drinking water and the river issues. Of course, we cannot separate the two issues. However, for instance, there is a River Jordan, which is one of the important river basin in the region. But however, Jordan is under water stress, as you mentioned. There is a lack of water. So unfortunately, I would say that it's part of the conflict nowadays, the water issue, especially when we are speaking about, you mentioned River Nile, which is very important for Egypt, the most populous Arab country in the region, with a population over 100 million. And there is a conflict now with Ethiopia. Sudan is involved as well. South Sudan as well, because Ethiopia not only plans, but it started to function the so-called JER, the Great Renaissance Dam of Ethiopia. And this impact is, of course, a decreasing volume of water for the Egyptian population, which the Egyptian government and the president sees as a kind of existential threat to Egypt, because you should provide basic things for your population, and I think water is one of a basic issue for your population. So this started to function, and there is an ongoing debate about the near future. But we can find conflict between Israel and Arab countries on the River Jordan historically, and of course it's the same case with Shatt al-Arab, where the Tiger and Euphrates meet, which is very important for oil export, because we not mentioned that the naval route for oil export at the Strait of Hormuz, Suez Canal, the two most important geopolitical places for the Middle East.
Could we say that here we have these three main water systems within the Middle East and North Africa? The River Nile, as you mentioned, the Jordan River, and the Tiger and the Euphrates. Interestingly, they have been, or they are at the moment, places of different conflicts. So while we are thinking of water as drinking water and in agriculture and industry and so on, there is also conflictuous situations, but they also have different aspects. So with the Nile, it is not, for Egypt, it is more drinking water and how to feed the more than 100 million population. For Ethiopia, the same water means much more electricity generation, because believe it or not, in Ethiopia, which is also about 100 million people, even now with the last huge developments, only half of the population have electricity at home. So for Ethiopia, it is not so much drinking water, of course it is, but it is energy generation as well. In the River Jordan, it is the Arab-Israeli conflict, agriculture and so on. With the Tiger and the Euphrates, as you mentioned, it is all of this, but also the transport of oil, especially from Iraq, which has only a very limited shore in the Persian Arab Gulf. So different aspects and different conflicts, but anyhow, water is becoming one of the most serious problems within the geopolitics of the Middle East.
Yeah, just let me mention two other features of water. And one, there is a potential of desalination of seawater, which is again quite costly. So it's an option for high-income countries, so Persian Gulf countries and Israel in the region. It's an option, of course, for the large population of Egypt as well. However, the Egyptian budget, I would say, could not meet the financial needs for this. So I'm a bit skeptical to provide the whole population of Middle East with desalinated water. However, we can find many desalination plants in the region functioning quite well. And the other feature which I would like to draw attention is the mismanagement of water in the region, unfortunately. And let me recall when we together been to Iran many times, and especially last time we've been to Isfahan, which we like very much. And this city, there is no water in the river. And when I've been there first time, 20 years ago, it was plenty of water in the river, but we can find an empty riverbed at this moment, which is not only about climate change issues, but however, it's part of the mismanagement of the government. And the problem is not only one river, but lakes and other water systems are under stress in the region.
And one more question related to water. In the very beginning, I've already mentioned the underground water reservoirs, which have been increasingly found especially under the Sahara. This is true for Egypt, true for Libya. Already Muammar Gaddafi, the former leader of Libya, was planning the great man-made river, meaning getting out this underground water, but also it goes for Algeria, I'm sure. Could you please tell us a few words about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting issue, I think. It's, of course, an option. However, the problem is, of course, the Sahara itself. the conflictuous situation that unfortunately it needs a stable government. And, the problem with Libya is the ongoing civil war situation, especially with those tribal areas in the south, radicalism in the neighboring countries. So I'm a bit skeptical about that. Of course, it's a potential for the near future, but I think it's not going to solve this problem in the near future. But let me continue with the nuclear energy. And let me ask you a bit, because you are an expert of the nuclear issues in the Middle East. Especially the first question is related to the dual use of nuclear energy, whether it's more a civilian or a military reason. Could you please explain a bit?
Yes, this is a very good question. And I usually tell the students as well that anything that is nuclear is by nature and from the very beginning dual use, because the same technologies and also part of the equipment and the same basic material is used for civilian purposes as would be used in the eventual case of nuclear weapons. Now, the Middle East and North Africa, so let me say that it's for the wider region, is a very interesting place. On the one hand, we have one country in the region which is supposed to have nuclear weapons, and that is Israel. Israel has never acknowledged and has never denied having nuclear weapons. This is the basis of the Israel strategy. However, we do have external countries in the region which we know are nuclear weapon states: the United States, Great Britain, sometimes France is present, Russia and China. These are the 5 nuclear weapon states, acknowledged nuclear weapon states, with more or less interests and presence in the region.
But what about Iran, Iranian nuclear issue?
Yes, and then there are states which had or which are having some infrastructure belonging to the so-called nuclear fuel cycle. And there were some states which were considered by the international community as countries that would want to go for nuclear weapons. In the 1990s, we were speaking about Iraq. And it was more or less proven that at least Saddam Hussein did have plans to have nuclear weapons. He never reached the capability. And then the Iraq War of 2003 finally put an end to all these plans, which practically meant more or less the end of the Iraqi civilian nuclear industry. Some remnants are left.
Libya had nuclear ambitions too.
Libya also had nuclear ambitions, and Libya had a small nuclear research reactor in Tajura, not far from Tripoli. And there was also some other Arab states. Egypt also does have some nuclear infrastructure. Syria also, but these countries usually stopped short of or were stopped short of nuclear weapons. Now, the 2000s, ever since 2002, Iran has been the main suspect. And in spite of the fact that the Iranian policy is very, very strict and very, very much advertised that we do not want nuclear weapons, there is also a fatwa, a religious decree by the Ayatollah Khamenei that it is forbidden in the Islamic Republic to produce, to have, to store whatever nuclear weapons. The international community has been very, very suspicious of Iran, and these negotiations, this problem has been going on for 2 decades now, 20 years now.
Yes, but it was a great success of the international community in 2015 when they signed the so-called nuclear deal with Iran. But, however, it seems it has collapsed recently.
Exactly so. The JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, concluded between the 5 nuclear weapon states and Germany and the European Union as such. and Iran was about a restriction of the Iranian nuclear program. Yet again, I would like to refer to the fact that according to the Iranians, this has always been a civilian nuclear program. So to put some constraints and some limits on this program in return for dissolving or lifting sanctions, Iran has been the target of many, many, many sanctions, one-sided, which means that unilateral sanctions, which means that by one country, United States or the United Kingdom or the European Union even. And also the United Nations sanctions, which are obligatory for everyone. Also, the sanctions against Iran have been manifolded. There have been sanctions over human rights issues, sanctions over the missile program, sanctions over the nuclear program, sanctions over many, many different things. So it is a very complex sanction system, sanctions regime. And still, in 2015, there was a moment when the agreement was about the nuclear component, the nuclear-related sanctions only. And at that time, it was the understanding of both the United States and the global leaders community that we start with the nuclear. And with the Iranian side's understanding, we start with the nuclear. And when cooperation is built up, confidence building is going on, then we can go on for further other conflictuous issues. For other reasons, the next United States President, Donald Trump, decided that the United States would step out of this agreement. And ever since then, everything is in limbo. So ever since then, what we found is that the Iranians have, in the meanwhile, accomplished the full nuclear fuel cycle, which, again, I would like to emphasize. The nuclear fuel cycle is the series of technologies that lead from the basic material uranium to the use. This may go towards the military use, but not necessarily. This is the same nuclear fuel cycle that would be used for civilian uses. Iran is the only country in the Middle East which has an operating nuclear power station, by the way, on the shore of the Persian Gulf. It is called Bushehr, and they are now in the phase of building their second nuclear power station. This is in operation. This has been in operation since 2012. Now, the United Arab Emirates has already started a civilian nuclear program.
Yeah, that's very important to mention that there are some kind of success stories in the region.
This is a new development. They are planning also several units. Baraka Unit 1, has been in operation, I think now for 2 years. The Saudis would like to start a civilian nuclear program, but that is not a little bit problematic because the leader of Saudi Arabia, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has said it before publicly and openly that if the Iranians have nuclear weapons, we will have nuclear weapons too. So there are huge suspicions, even from the United States, if they should help Saudi Arabia with a civilian nuclear program. And there have been many different proposals in the past decades or so that would have aimed at put up a joint nuclear fuel cycle with the participation of all the Gulf states, for example, because that means a kind of a guarantee they can control each other, see what they are doing together. So there would be different solutions. At the moment, it is not on the agenda, but definitely it was a big blow to the success of the JCPOA, of the nuclear deal, which was operating correctly, and the Iranians were delivering what they promised. It was a blow when President Trump withdrew from the deal.
The very last question. I read somewhere that in Saudi Arabia, Saudis has the largest reserves of uranium in the entire region, which is not only for a nuclear power plant, however, it is for export. And Chinese now been investing in these projects, export uranium. How do you see that? Because you mentioned the suspicion from the United States, and of course it's a regional issue.
Yes, uranium is an interesting thing. When before the Second World War, the nuclear programs, both civilian and military, started, and even under the Second World War, there were just 2 places globally where uranium was found. Now, since then, several countries and several uranium mines have been discovered. For example, in southern Hungary, near Pécs, there is also a uranium mine, a small one, and it has been closed for a while now. Also in Iran, they have found uranium of their own. So it is, since the geography and geological environment of Iran and Saudi Arabia can be very similar. Look at the oil and gas, for example. So it is very easy to understand that there can be uranium in Saudi Arabia. But uranium mine in itself is not enough to a program. So in itself, it is not enough. However, it can be sold. And I think that from this point of view, it may be even advantageous if one nuclear weapon state, acknowledged nuclear weapon state, or someone who does have the whole of the industry takes over the export or import of this uranium ore. I don't know what the end result will be. Obviously, the international community would not like to have too much uranium going to China, but militarily it is a different issue.
Thank you so much. And I think in the very near future, we return to this energy issue, which is, I think, a hot topic even for Europeans.
Thank you for listening to the Khayrion podcast. We are looking forward to sharing with you more exciting news on the politics and business of the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond. For further information, please follow us at khayrion.com, as well as on X and LinkedIn.